So the major themes from my research into this coming year are that regulatory risks are going to rise, supply chain risks are going to rise. Ransomware, unfortunately, will get even nastier. Cyberconflict is going to continue to cause collateral damage, something which we tend not to think of necessarily if we're a domestic U.S. organization, but we can get hit. Ask Merck or FedEx about collateral damage from cyberconflict. Next generation, this use of machine learning, ML, and artificial intelligence, AI, in security software and software in general will potentially be the next war zone in the arms race between attackers and defenders. The Internet of Things and Internet of Things, IoT, and Industrial Control Systems, ICS, will, I think, manifest their deficiencies in one or more attacks in 2018. And we'll talk about some other things as well: biometrics, two-factor authentication, Bitcoin, and what I would call other wildcards. Oh, and a bonus theme. So the cloud. Some people will groan at this string of puns, but the cloud is clearly reigning in the area of application development, with serverless apps becoming a big deal. But it has to be reined in. It has to have security applied to it to avoid raining data. And I'll give some examples of the cloud raining data later on. So regulatory risks. And I totally appreciate it if you groan when you see, and wow, major typo there, I'm sorry, GDPR, not GDR. GDR was something quite different. General Data Protection Regulation, right? So this is the EU Privacy Security Law. It's in place as a law already, but it will be enforced as of May 25, 2018. And it really is a big thing. At the ISC Squared Security Congress this year, there were 3 panels, I think, on this. And in all of them, people were saying, the main question from the audience was, does it really apply to me? And it does apply to you if you do business in Europe, if you have data about people who reside in the EU, not just EU citizens, but people who reside in the EU. If you have personal information about them, whether they're customers or employees, or you're soliciting prospects from the EU, it does apply to you. And there's a lot of legal questions around how would that be actually enforced, but it's going to be a big thing. Big in one sense because I think it applies a different way of managing things like permissions for marketing than different from the way people have been doing it. It puts a lot of emphasis on consent and also the ability to change and remove information you may have about somebody to whom you've been marketing. It's a big thing in terms of the fines. So the fines are up to $12 million approximately, because the fines are in euros, or 2% of global revenue. And I figured out in the case of Equifax, that was hundreds of millions of dollars if the Equifax breach had been deemed a violation of GDPR. So your organization may be on top of this. Your organization may be talking about this. Point is, May 25th is coming up, and I think there will be cases brought fairly quickly. If you've been through things like PCI compliance, or you've been through HIPAA compliance, there are sometimes sort of grace periods to give people time. I think some people in the EU have, under the opinion, we've had enough time and there will be enforcement actions in 2018. Other areas in regulatory risk are, I think, the FTC. Right now, if you're watching what's going on between the FTC and the FCC, there are lots of debates over who is responsible for what. And I think the FTC will want to show its authority over matters of privacy and security in 2018. I know it's actively seeking test cases, for example, to establish precedent around Internet of Things, cloud security issues, and overreach in security product marketing. They did a presentation at Black Hat, letting people know about this activity they're engaging in. And then state laws. What's interesting about state laws in the privacy security area is that states are kind of taking up the slack because of stalemate in Washington. So CompTIA, the Computer Trade Industry Association, to which CompTIA belongs, and I'm on their policy advisory committee, they were monitoring about 1,200 IT-related bills last year, well, in 2017 in the state legislatures. Almost half of them, 660, were around privacy and security. They didn't all pass, but it shows more activity there. California has started to fine people under its own privacy laws, not necessarily the federal laws, and then we have New York security laws around financial organizations there. So I think look for enforcement actions there. Let's move on to supply chain risks. And if you are in a business that makes things, you may think of supply chain risk as the problem of getting deliveries on time in order to make the widgets that you're putting together in your factory. This is slightly different. This is the data supply chain and then the software supply chain. So data supply chain issues are things like people who process your data not being as secure as you or as secure as they need to be. And we saw some examples of that in 2017. We saw Netflix, ABC, HBO all have problems where their intellectual property, movies, TV shows, was safe within their organization, but sent out to a distributor or a post-production house and compromised there. It was attacked there. And so the idea being that your intellectual property and the personal information that you have and are required to keep safe may be at risk with partners, may be at risk in that supply chain. And then a different example, Debenhams is a department store chain in the UK. They decided that they would get into the online flower business, and their online florist suffered a breach which reflected badly on Debenhams. So that you need to make sure that if you're working with other organizations, sharing data, your customers' data, your intellectual property, that the people with whom you're working are taking as much care of it as you are. The software supply chain is different again. This is, as I mentioned with that ME doc accounting software in the Ukraine, compromised updates or downloads of legitimate software that somebody has been able to compromise. And in addition to that accounting app in the Ukraine, there was a media player on Apple Macs that ESET found quite a nasty piece of Trojan software in there, going out with in the actual code of the legitimate software from the company, and we alerted them to it, and I think we stopped that fairly quickly. But it is something to watch for, because that's signed code which is going to be accepted by your system if it's coming from a legitimate source, even though it's got illegitimate code within it. So in 2018, ransomware, I think, is really headed for potentially a triple threat. The first of those three prongs is targeted attacks on high-value targets. In reading through the predictions of other organizations, I think it's Forbes does a really big roundup of predictions. Some of my colleagues at other companies do their own predictions. There seems to be a consensus that for some ransomware villains, the money is seen in 2018 as being in organizations who've got cash, who can afford to pay, and who have very valuable data. And so instead of just kind of spraying out a whole bunch of phishing emails and hoping you'll get some victims of your ransomware, people are going to be looking to do more targeted attacks where they'll do reconnaissance on the victim and take their time to get in there, but then do serious high ransom demands. But I don't think, unfortunately, that the random attacks are going to go away, because, and I think Bitcoin and crypto coin in general is sort of the wild card in 2018 in a sense. You've seen the value of these currencies wildly fluctuating. The more they go up, the more incentive there is to steal them, to try and get them, and so on. And just a little bit of math here. If you'd been doing ransomware in 2016, and you were kind of small time. You ended the year with about $80,000 in Bitcoin at the end of 2016. If you hadn't sold that, it would be worth $1.4 million today. And two things could happen, really. You could say, wait a minute, I'm going to get out of the business now. I'm going to cash in. I'm a millionaire. I'm going to quit doing cybercrime. On the other hand, you could say, wow, this is really profitable. I'm going to keep on doing it. And I really don't know which way things are going to go there. But we do see now ransomware in the third prong of this triple threat as a weapon. In NotPetya, there was no, effort, or there's no ability to get back from its encryption of the data. And it's a really nasty kind of attack. And so this relates to the conflict zone thing, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it is important to realize that, if your ransomware strategy had been to buy some Bitcoin just in case you got attacked and you could then pay to get your files back, that's probably even a worse strategy now than it was a year or 2 years ago. By the way, you don't always get your stuff back when you pay, sometimes for the simple reason the ransomware isn't written very well. So, yeah, ransomware, definitely a challenge. We saw in 2017, and I see no reason that this won't keep growing, ransomware via, again, I think that's a typo, remote desktop protocol. The attacking of servers directly through default credentials, weak credentials, brute force attacks are quite a big thing. There's quite a big market in compromised server credentials for remote access. As a criminal, you go online to the dark market, you buy some targets, you get in there, and you ransom the server files. And that is a very nasty kind of attack. And basically, you need anti-malware on your servers, and you need two-factor authentication, at least on all your servers, to keep this attack at bay. So we're seeing now ongoing cyber conflict in different parts of the world, where, particularly I think in the case of the Ukraine, which is almost like a test bed for cyber conflict, the bad actors are trying different kinds of attacks, and those attacks pop up relative to geopolitical factors. Right, so you saw companies like Merck, FedEx, Maersk, the shipping company, DHL, Cadbury, all badly impacted by NotPetya, hundreds of millions of dollars per company in some cases in costs. They're not really a participant in those conflicts. They're based in other countries, not in the conflict country, but they do business in conflict countries, and some of these attacks are spreading outside the conflict zone. What I'm saying is you need to think about, in terms of risks planning, risk strategy, risk management strategy, moving ahead about this. Where are your international connections? Obviously, three companies there are shipping companies, and they're doing business across state lines, obviously. But there were some law firms hit because they had clients in conflict zones and so on. Something to think about. I think we'll see aggressive malware campaigns from these hotspots. Ukraine continuing to be a problem. North Korea is an increasingly desperate adversary. We know that they will lash out. Iran, we're seeing an uptick in Iranian hacking for political purposes. Our relations with them aren't going particularly well. Indications that one of the HBO hacks was Iranian-based. And then the Middle East, and that's all I'll say about that. So, in a more technical area of threat, we've seen a couple of years now of next generation marketing, certainly, of security products as next generation, but big data and as well. The whole idea that we can use large amounts of data processed through machine learning, ML, and artificial intelligence, AI, to learn about attacks on our systems to better defend against those attacks. And I'm certainly not the first person to point this out. The bad guys can use this stuff too. And as an analogy there, direct analogy with code, right? Legitimate people write legitimate code to achieve legitimate ends, gains in productivity, and so on. Coding can be used for malicious purposes. And as a resource, coding it's not a natural resource that you don't mine it. It's not limited to some countries that have deposits of coding capability. And in fact, coding capability is something that can be gained by any country. And there are some countries that have really good coding ability, even though they don't have a highly developed infrastructure or economy. And so we shouldn't think that it's only going to be the good guys that are using machine learning and AI. The bad guys are going to be working on it. Now, kind of a middle ground here, or indicator of things to come, a couple of examples which are coming out of the academic space, but showing the potential here. There was research about password guessing, right? The ability, once, say you've managed to get a hold of a whole bunch of hashed passwords, how do you break that? Somebody used something called a generative adversarial network, or a group of them, to improve that capability. And this one is an interesting example of research done and ways of not necessarily breaking the AI as it's deployed, but as it's being developed. So this is an experiment that was done recently on how to fool image recognition. And this is going to be something that people are at some point going to try and monetize, I think. The Internet of Things and industrial control systems manifest deficiencies. We're seeing reports are definitely there of probing of power grid, of electricity generation, and I think that the Industoria research has raised awareness of that, but it, on the other side, it was the research was speaking to people who are already seeing the probing of our systems. I mean, when my colleagues Robert Leposky and Anton Cherepanov presented at Black Hat on Industoria, it was a huge room, it was packed, and it was silent. I mean, people were very, very, I think, interested in this and concerned about this. And so I don't want to be alarmist. There's a lot of work being done to remedy the weaknesses in industrial control systems, but it's kind of a race against time, I think. And part of what I think is undermining that to a certain extent is this continuing use of really consumer-grade technology in an industrial context. And we're definitely not building in security into our industrial and our Internet of Things infrastructure at the level we need to be. We're still adding it on later, and that is leaving gaps. So I think we'll see more attacks in 2018. Will the power go out in Ukraine over Christmas again? We don't know at this point, but I think we may see the first US attack in 2018. And something else that I think we need to watch for in IoT, particularly if you're investing a lot of money in it, is how much does it cost to keep your IoT working, to keep it running? Some research is suggesting that while we're deploying these billions of devices, keeping them going is going to be a big challenge. So let's look at this. The cloud, right? I'm getting very concerned about serverless apps, and I'm getting very concerned about the amount of data that people are throwing up into the cloud without proper protection. So I'm not going to read through all of these in great detail, but there's one after another, after another, after another examples of people putting a bunch of data in the cloud and not protecting it properly. Now, I know Amazon is working on this, and people are working on this, but again, if you hook this back, say, to supply chain, right? Say you've shared a whole bunch of data with an organization, and it's using cloud services, and it's using misconfigured cloud storage, right? That's you're responsible if it's your data. If it gets breached, you could be tarnished. And frankly, I'm really scared by Pentagon using Amazon servers. Not giving me a warm, fuzzy feeling. So let's move on. A couple of other items here. Two-factor authentication and biometrics. I'm hoping that two-factor authentication really takes off in 2018. It should, and you're going to be in trouble if it doesn't. What I'm saying there is if you've got servers accessible on the internet and you don't have two-factor authentication on them, and those get compromised, you're going to have no sympathy, and you may have legal liability. I mean, if you look at JP Morgan Chase a couple of years back, a server was compromised. It was the one server that didn't have 2FA on it. Biometrics increasingly are going to be used. 2017 was just proof again that passwords and PIN codes are a major weakness. 2FA can definitely incorporate biometrics. I think we'll see more use of biometrics, but biometrics will be attacked. Witness the research people are doing on how to fool biometrics. And you can't I don't want to fault people testing these limits. Somebody's got to test the limits, and we saw that, some people broke Face ID on the iPhone very quickly after it was released. Around these academic tests, there are usually a lot of qualifiers, like certain conditions have to be met. So these things are not necessarily immediately monetizable as attacks, but they're an indication of where attacks may come down the road. Something that really hasn't received the attention that I think it needs is the return of Coppersmith's attack and other systemic issues. So these are problems which affect some of the building blocks of network security, internet security. This research by Masaryk University in Czech Republic revealed serious problems with an implementation of RSA public key encryption, requiring a serious amount of work to remedy. And I think one of the reasons this isn't getting a lot of press is nobody wants to talk about this. I mean, in Spain, they're looking at having to replace tens of millions of digital ID cards because they're using code that can't be changed on the card, and it's code that has this weak RSA implementation. Now, there are some people who think RSA public key is not strong enough. This isn't that problem. This is a problem of otherwise fairly strong RSA public key encryption being implemented in a way which led to shortcuts. And the research out of the university, very, very interesting, very responsibly done. They followed the full responsible disclosure process. And now there's a lot of work being done. And you may have been getting security updates on your operating system and so on around this. But what seems to be the case is that these things are out there. And I'd like to say two things. First of all, when scary news breaks, we try to cover it in an objective way and in a non-scary way over at welivesecurity.com. And I'll show you that link again in a moment. welivesecurity.com is where ESET researchers write up their findings, their opinions, and advice. These problems, big problems, and there's another one just come out, the robot attack, which is another attack on encryption, very complex to understand, but it basically weakens SSL. Are they a big deal or not? And we try to put out our assessment of that. Currently these encryption weaknesses are not being exploited in the wild as far as we can tell, but there is the potential for that to happen if the problems aren't patched. Another wild card, I think, is Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. As I mentioned earlier, it's possible that the rising value of cryptocurrency will fuel crime. There are some criminals out there who've got a lot of Bitcoin and thus a lot of money to finance further operations. We have seen ESET researchers found an interesting piece of Bitcoining malware in the web browser plugin. You know, why not, if you're trying to make money off the internet, get somebody else to mine coins for you using malware to distribute your code? And it's possible that the other side of this is that if cryptocurrency takes a dive, or organizations, and we've just seen, I think, Valve, the gaming company, say it's not going to accept cryptocurrency because of the issues in the fluctuation of value in it, other payment systems may suffer abuse because criminals will want to try and use those instead. I'll try and give you, just before we close up and I answer questions here, some hope. There is a thing in criminology called desistance. This is the idea that criminals stop, they desist at some point in time, and it's a real thing. In before the internet and before cybercrime, criminologists were studying why bank robbers and burglars give up at some point in time, and there's some fairly, reasonable explanations for this. A criminal gets married, has children, has finally found a job. There may be a push by law enforcement to discourage certain cybercrimes, certain crimes, and people decide, it's just too risky, and so on. Cashing out, as I mentioned earlier, may be also a form of desistance, or an encouragement to desistance. On the side of encouraging people to desist, we saw quite a lot of high-profile arrests in 2017, which gives us hope. ESET has been playing its part as a responsible security company to assist in cases. We've assisted in takedowns this year of botnets, working with Microsoft, other vendors, and teams of lawyers, and international law enforcement to take down botnets. And we actually were directly involved in the sentencing and jailing of somebody who was involved in the Windico case, which was a malware affecting Linux servers and using it for malicious purposes. And so, I think we're making progress there, but definitely there's room for further improvement. And that generally, I think, depends on resources. Not just giving more money to law enforcement, but within law enforcement agencies putting priority on the use of those resources for cracking down on cybercrime. And frankly, international diplomacy could actually make a big difference. Think back to collateral damage from Cyberconflict. If we cleaned up some of those, or cleared up some of those conflicts, that would reduce the level of cybercrime and the level of threat to our organizations and their data.